Welcome to the debate. Imagine for a moment owing a massive amount of money, an amount so huge that you can never, ever hope to pay it back.
Yeah, that is a terrifying thought.
It really is. And throughout most of human history, you basically only had two choices. You could live in absolute fear of the person you borrowed from, or, well, if you had an army, you could just destroy them.
Right.
It was a brutal, binary world. You break a financial contract, and violence is the only way out.
Yeah. Debt was a completely mortal issue. It had a natural lifespan. If the person who lent the money died, the debt usually died right along with them. So, debtors had a very dark, very literal motivation to make their money problems disappear.
Exactly. Today, we are tracing the really incredible historical evolution of national debt. We are looking at the changing relationship between the people who lend money and the governments that borrow it. And our central question is this: does the modern financial system, specifically modern monetary theory, or MMT, represent the ultimate successful evolution of the state protecting its economy? Or is it an unsustainable, infinite trap that requires an escape to a fixed supply system?
It is a massive question. We are going to look at how we went from the violent destruction of the Knights Templar in 1307 to the creation of the Bank of England in 1694.
Right.
All the way to modern fiat currency and the rise of decentralized, fixed-supply networks like Bitcoin.
And just to lay my cards on the table, I look at this history as a story of incredible human progress. The evolution from violent debt cancellation to modern money printing represents the state finally mastering the financial system.
Mastering it, really?
Yes, mastering it. We learned how to build infrastructure, protect citizens, and prevent massive recessions without, resorting to brutality.
And I look at the exact same history and see a totally different takeaway. This is not a success story. It is the story of creating an immortal debt trap.
An immortal trap?
Yeah, we built an endless loop of money printing that requires constant, infinite expansion. I will be arguing that this system is so fundamentally broken that it forces us to seek a hard escape hatch, a financial system with a fixed supply of money.
Well, let me start by unpacking why I think the history of debt is actually a triumph of survival. The state is the ultimate debtor, and it had to learn how to survive. We have to look at the major turning point in the year 1307. King Philip IV of France owed an absolute fortune to the Knights Templar.
And we should remember who the Templars were at that time. They were essentially the world's first multinational bank.
Right, they had a massive network.
Yeah, pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land would deposit gold in Europe, get a piece of paper, and then withdraw gold when they arrived. The Templars became incredibly wealthy, and King of France borrowed heavily from them to fight his wars.
Exactly. But eventually the king could not pay them back. He was completely bankrupt. So on Friday, October 13th, 1307, he used dawn arrests, torture, and eventually burning at the stake to wipe out his debts.
Wow, just horrific.
It was. He literally killed his creditors. The money he owed them vanished because they vanished. It was pure physical violence.
A massive trauma for anyone who lent money. It sent a very clear message. Do not let the ruler of a country owe you too much money or your life is in danger.
Right. Waiting for a creditor to die of old age was just too slow for a desperate king. But let's fast forward a bit to 1694. England's King William III needed massive amounts of money to fight wars with France. Private lenders, known as goldsmiths, were understandably terrified. They remembered the history. They were charging outrageous interest rates, sometimes 20 or 30%, because they were constantly afraid the king would just default, or worse, execute them.
The system was completely paralyzed by fear.
Yes. But then, a Scottish merchant named William Paterson came up with an idea that changed the world.
Okay.
Paterson proposed a brilliant compromise. He told the king, "We will lend you 1.2 million pounds. But here was the trick. There was no end date on the loan.
Wait, no end date at all?
None. The government never had to pay back the original amount of money. They just had to pay a perpetual interest rate of 8% every single year, forever. They created a corporation to handle this, the Bank of England. It stopped the violence, gave the king his war funds, and kept the lenders safe.
You call it brilliant. I call it a total distortion of reality.
How so?
Well, in the natural world, everything has a lifespan. A debt between two people has a birth and a death. You borrow money, you pay it off, the debt ends. Patterson's idea made debt immortal.
But let's look at how it actually functioned mechanically. Before 1694, kings would literally just say, I am the king, I cancel my debt. That ruins the economy. People lose their life savings. Patterson created a system of trust. The government issued paper notes backed by this debt. It gave the state stability because they finally had a reliable way to fund themselves without destroying wealth. If the alternative was outrageous interest rates from goldsmiths who constantly feared default, wasn't immortalizing the debt a necessary price for economic stability and state survival?
At the cost of trapping the taxpayer. Let's break down how that 8% forever actually works in practice.
Okay.
The principal, the original £1.2 million, is never repaid. That means wealth begins to flow eternally from the taxes of everyday people to cover those endless 8% interest payments. The king and the creditors made a pact. They established a central bank backed by the government's power to tax the public.
But the lenders could trade that debt. If they needed their money back, they didn't have to ask the king for it. They just sold the bond to someone else. That created liquidity. It created a modern financial market.
Exactly. The debt became a tradable asset. The creditor never dies. They just sell the right to collect taxes to the next person. They essentially decided that the future labor of unborn citizens would be used to pay interest on a war fought hundreds of years ago.
I mean, that's one way to frame it.
The creditor escaped death, absolutely, but the everyday taxpayer was chained to an immortal debt. That is not stability. That is a parasite attaching itself to the host forever.
I see why you frame it that way, but think about what that stability actually bought. The host the nation grew stronger because the state could borrow reliably, it could build a global navy, it could build roads, and eventually transition into the modern industrial era.
Right.
The debt lives on, but so does the nation. It was a necessary price for economic survival.
But relying on a central bank and wealthy bondholders still kept the state chained to private wealth. They still had to convince wealthy people to lend them the money in the first place, paying them that eternal 8%.
Which brings us to the next massive shift. It took a few centuries, but eventually the government realized it didn't need to rely on wealthy lenders at all.
Right, under modern monetary theory.
Yes, MMT. Under MMT, the state completely masters the system. The government looks at the setup and realizes, wait a minute, we are the ones who print the money. We issue the currency. Why are we borrowing it?
The debtor realizes they have the ultimate power.
Precisely. If you issue the currency, you cannot go bankrupt in your own currency. It is mathematically impossible. Under MMT, the government becomes the unlimited spender.
Right.
It doesn't need to wait for a wealthy merchant to lend it money. Let's look at a concrete example. Say the country needs a new billion-dollar bridge. Under old economic thinking, the government has to tax the citizens $1 billion first or borrow it from rich people. Under MMT, the government simply types $1 billion into the bank accounts of the construction workers and building companies. The bridge gets built. New wealth is created. No one has to be unemployed just because of a lack of money on a banker's spreadsheet.
But hold on. If the government can just print infinite money to pay for everything by typing numbers into a computer, what happens to taxes? Why do I still pay taxes if the government doesn't need my money to fund its operations?
That is the most brilliant part of the theory. Under MMT, taxes are no longer used to fund the government. The government already has infinite money. Instead, taxes are used simply to cool down inflation.
Cool down inflation?
Yeah. Think of taxation like a furnace. If the government prints too much money to build too many bridges and prices start going up at the grocery store, the government raises taxes. But it doesn't spend that tax money. It essentially burns it. It takes the money out of the economy to reduce the money supply and bring prices back down.
Okay.
The state uses currency creation as a powerful, peaceful tool to manage human prosperity.
I look at that system printing money to spend and taxing to destroy money, and I see a fatal flaw. You are describing a system that sounds perfect on paper, but it suffers from a dialectic inversion.
A dialectic inversion? You're saying the very tool the state created to save itself ends up trapping it?
Precisely. It's a fancy way of saying the solution flips and becomes the master of the person who created it. Let's look at how the mechanics of your bridge example actually play out in reality.
Okay, let's hear it.
You print money to stimulate the economy, the bridge gets built, the workers get paid, the economy booms. But what happens the next year? The bridge is done. Those workers still need jobs. The economy has become completely dependent on that billion-dollar injection of new money. So the next year, you have to print $2 billion, then $4 billion.
I wouldn't call that a trap. I would call that active, ongoing management of a growing society.
But it requires infinite expansion. It's like an engine that requires more and more fuel just to stay at the exact same speed. The economy dies without constant deficit spending. So the government is forced to spend bigger and run larger deficits just to save the system they created.
Right, but
The original purpose, building bridges or helping citizens, becomes secondary. The primary goal is just keeping the immortal debt machine from collapsing.
human population grows. Technology grows. Our capacity to produce goods expands. Shouldn't our money supply expand to match that physical growth?
Matching growth is one thing, but this is where the source materials metaphor is so important, the snake swallowing itself whole.
Walk me through that metaphor. How exactly is the modern economy a snake eating itself?
Think about the interest on that immortal debt we talked about. Even in a fiat system, governments still issue bonds. They owe so much money that the interest payments become massive. Eventually, the interest becomes so large that the government has to print new money just to pay the interest on the old money. It is consuming its own currency's purchasing power to survive. The debt becomes a meaningless number on a spreadsheet, totally disconnected from physical reality. The system demands endless expansion, feeding on itself until the money loses its value entirely.
So if you believe this MMT system, this fiat money system, is a sealed trap that will eventually eat itself, what is the alternative? We can't go back to 1307 and start physically attacking bank managers.
No, obviously not. But we have to recognize that an infinite loop requires a hard escape hatch. We need a system that brings reality back to finance, and that is where a fixed supply system, like Bitcoin, becomes fundamentally necessary.
A fixed supply, meaning there is a hard mathematical limit on how much money can ever exist.
Yes, let's look at the mechanics of why that matters. Bitcoin has a strict, unchangeable, fixed supply of 21 million coins. There will never be any more.
Right.
More importantly, there is no central issuer. There is no king, no parliament, and no central bank that can just decide to print 1 trillion more units to pay off bad debts. Because there is no endless printing, there can be no eternal, immortal debt. If you make a bad loan in a fixed supply system, you lose the money. The debt dies. It brings mortality back to finance.
I know. Listeners are probably thinking right now, isn't a fixed supply just going back to the gold standard? We know how that ended during the Great Depression.
Well,
If you have a completely rigid money supply, you remove our ability to respond to emergencies. Imagine a global pandemic hits or a sudden severe economic depression. Under MMT, the government can print money to send relief checks to families so they don't starve while the world is shut down.
right, but
Under your fixed system, the government literally cannot create money. Businesses go bankrupt, people lose their homes. The suffering would be immense. Aren't you trading an endless loop for a system that just lets people fall off a cliff?
I understand the fear of that. It sounds harsh. But we have to look at what causes the cliff in the first place. The massive crises we face are very often caused by the endless printing itself.
How so?
When you flood an economy with artificial money to keep it growing, you create massive bubbles, housing bubbles, stock market bubbles. Everything gets artificially expensive because there's too much money chasing the same amount of goods.
But when those bubbles pop, MMT acts as a shock absorber. It allows the government to absorb the impact so the citizens don't feel every single bump on the road.
But the citizens do feel the bump. They just feel it differently. They feel it through inflation. The government prints money to bail out the system. The numbers on the spreadsheet go up, but the prices at the grocery store go up too.
Right.
Your savings buy less bread. The citizens are still paying for the crisis, just in a hidden way. The 8% tax from the year 1694 has simply evolved into the invisible tax of inflation today. The immoral creditor is still getting paid, and the taxpayer is still footing the bill. A fixed supply system forces a society to live within its actual means. It stops the artificial bubbles from forming in the first place.
But bringing mortality back to finance means bringing suffering back to the people who rely on that finance. The whole journey we discussed from 1307 to 1694 to today was about human beings trying to find a softer, more manageable way to deal with debt. You want to force the system back into a rigid box.
I wouldn't call it a box. I'd call it reality.
I look at MMT and see a flexible tool that prioritizes human well-being over rigid mathematical rules.
And I look at that flexible tool and see a machine that slowly drains the wealth of the middle class to keep itself running. If the money can be printed infinitely, your savings are always at risk of being diluted. The government has to keep feeding the snake. That is why an alternative outside the control of the state is absolutely essential for financial freedom.
It is a fascinating tension, and it touches on the very foundation of how our society operates. I think this is a perfect moment to pull these threads together and give our listeners a clear summary of where we both stand on this massive timeline.
Absolutely, that makes sense.
So, to summarize my position, when we look at the long sweep of history, the transition from the violent death destruction of the Knights Templar to the perpetual loans of the Bank of England, and finally, to modern monetary theory, it shows remarkable human progress. The state has learned to use currency creation as a powerful, peaceful tool. We substituted the brutal fear of bankruptcy and physical violence with the mathematical management of the economy. By issuing its own currency, a government can ensure its people are employed, its roads are built, and its society remains stable. Debt isn't a monster, it is just a tool we have finally learned how to use to benefit humanity.
And to summarize my view, this so-called progress merely shifted the burden onto the backs of everyday people. We traded violent, sudden defaults for eternal taxation to pay an immortal debt.
Right.
The system created in 1694 ensured that lenders never lose and taxpayers never stop paying. MMT is simply the final stage of this trap. It is an endless loop of printing, an engine that always needs more fuel, eating its own value through inflation. That is why a decentralized fixed supply alternative is not just a technological experiment, it is an essential escape hatch to break the cycle of immortal debt.
It is clear we both agree on one fundamental fact from the material. The nature of debt has completely transformed. It changed from a mortal, dangerous contract between two living individuals into an immortal, systemic force that shapes our entire world.
Yes, we converge entirely on the history. Debt went from something that died with the creditor to something that lives forever on a central bank spreadsheet. Where we diverge is whether this is a sustainable path forward.
Right. We continue to disagree on whether endless fiat printing is a sustainable tool for societal growth or a dangerous infinite trap. As we wrap up today, I want to leave our listeners with that vivid image we started with. Think about King Philip IV in the Knights Templar. Think about how far we have traveled from the violence of Friday the 13th, 1307, to the digital spreadsheets of today. The journey of debt across the centuries is incredible.
It really is. It impacts every single paycheck, every grocery bill, and every tax return we file.
So look closely at the modern economic policies happening right now in your own country. Ask yourself, are we finally mastering the financial system to serve humanity? Or are we merely feeding an immortal loop that has swallowed us whole? There is so much more to explore in this material. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.